You guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I might? Okay, cool. So in the program it says I'm supposed to end at 10:40, so I'm 5 minutes over. We'll try and make this quick. Hot off the press, innovation, nice little graphic there. How the media can actually spur more active climate change policy, and what are the important variables for that to happen? That is the question I'm going to try to explore. If TEDx U of M is a marathon, I'm going to try to do this in a sprint, so let's get running. I'm going to do this through a series of lessons that I've learned in a research project at the Ford School, which I've conducted with Dr. Barry Ray, who's one of the foremost climate scientists here at the university. The first thing I want to convey is that the media has actually been reporting on climate change for a very long time. Climate change is not a new issue like many of us perceive. Take this quote, for example. The Earth is steadily growing warmer. What will happen to man if climatic conditions are thus changed? This appeared in a New York Times article which was published in 1932. And by the 1950s, we already started having human activity. Articles talk about human activity impacting climate change. So not as far back as when the dinosaurs roamed the Earth and smoked cigarettes, but I mean, media reporting goes back a pretty long time. So the second lesson I want to convey is that the mass media, 78 years later, is still our #1 source of news. If you ask an individual on an average day, where do you get your news, 57% will say from television and 40% will say from newspapers, and less than a quarter will say the internet. Obviously our generation is different, but the mass media is still our #1 information diffuser. So there's reason to believe that media reporting can actually impact individual behavior because we act on the information that we receive from the media. And let me give you a specific example. In 2000, there was a cyclone that hit Mozambique, flooded the country, damaged the infrastructure. 6 months earlier, there was an even more significant cyclone that hit the region of Orissa in India. The Mozambique cyclone killed 700. In India, that was about 12 times higher. 10,000 people died. In Mozambique, 1 million people were displaced. In India, 15 million people were displaced. By almost any measure, the Indian cyclone was worse than the one in Mozambique. And yet humanitarian aid in Mozambique was 7 times greater. Why is that? Most of the research trying to answer this question suggests that the devastation in India was so great that media crews weren't able to access the area and report from it. Whereas in Mozambique, you had very dramatic footage of, seeing here people like being stranded on a bridge in the middle of a flooded river, a woman forced to give birth in a tree to try to escape floodwaters. These sorts of images really propel people to donate in the Mozambique case, but not in India. So media coverage can actually impact how we donate money. In 2000, a study was conducted which showed that media reports actually help people develop a problem-solving perspective. What do I mean by that? In the early 1990s, if you said climate change, people thought smog, pollution. They thought of visual representations of the problem. But by 2000, in this case, people have begun moving towards developing a perspective where climate change is a process of inputs and outputs. So cars produce carbon emissions cause global warming, therefore we want to regulate carbon emissions, right? So we have this sort of linear causation process, a very simplified model, but it works, where coverage leads to understanding or the development of these problem-solving perspectives, which leads to action. And if you think this has a domino effect, that's why I really want to focus on coverage, because if that domino doesn't fall, neither do the next two. We have this other sort of process where we have a scientific consensus. I'm going to say it right now. Climate change is happening, and there's almost like a 90% consensus in the scientific community that humans are at least partially causing it. The media is responsible to convey this consensus to individuals to sort of motivate action, right? Well, what happens to the media if it starts lacking the resources to cover these sorts of issues? Or if the government starts sort of trying to influence media coverage because it's not in its immediate best interest to take action on climate change. We sort of start seeing this coverage disappear. The information diffusion doesn't happen, and public perception and the scientific consensus sort of become mutually exclusive arenas of information. So media independence, how freely it is able to convey information, should matter. If it has the resources, if it doesn't have the influences trying to prevent it from conveying the scientific consensus of climate change, we should see people sort of take more action. So I sort of gathered data from about 60 countries to try to see whether press freedom correlates with climate change performance. This is a climate change performance index which was recently developed in Germany, and we see that press freedom has about a 96% probability of correlating positively with climate change performance. So that means that as you increase press freedom, you increase climate change performance, and that correlates better than, I mean, look at democracy. Democracy sucks in this case, right? Now, if you look at correlations with greenhouse gas emissions, you get an even more significant correlation, about 99.99% probability of this, in this case, negative correlation. As you increase press freedom, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and this is actually the best correlating variable, right? So we get this sort of linear relationship, whereas you increase press freedom, climate change activism, on average, also goes up. Now, correlation is obviously not causation, but this is a relationship that is not explored at all in the academic literature. There's not a single study that tries to look at the relationship with these two variables, and my data seems to at least push for the idea that press freedom actually is a good indicator of climate change performance. So I want to end real quickly with your role. My assessment would lead you to believe that if you influence media reporting, you can actually spur individuals and national governments to take a more active stance on climate change. So you want to influence media reporting. It used to be that the only way you could do that is with these sort of arcane letters to the editor, but now we actually have a whole bunch of new tools at our disposal. So even though the internet is still only about 25% of our information is gathered from the internet, the mass media increasingly relies on blogs, on Twitter, on Facebook, and social networking sites to report, right? So you can actually begin to play your role towards spurring more active climate change activism, and what's even better is you can do it from the comfort of your home computer. Thank you guys for having me.